Have you ever read a novel, like a mystery or a thriller novel, where by the time you came to the end of the novel, you were completely blown away by who the real perpetrator or the criminal was, or who or what was responsible for the turn of events so far? And imagine you read that novel for the second time. And this time you will begin to see that the author has given you so many clues throughout which you didn't realize, right? Now, something to remember here is this: just because you know the ending, or just because you know what was the cause of everything, or who the real perpetrator, etc., was, doesn't mean the entire novel is useless, right? The author was building you to that moment of truth. In the same way, when we think of the story of Scripture, we know that all of Scripture is pointing to Christ, the ultimate reality. And we have already experienced that, and we are living in that age of the church. Now, just because Christ has come and we see the reality in Him, doesn't mean the entire story of Scripture is pointless. In fact, when we look at those stories, we begin to relive what the clues, the beauty of what God gave the foreshadows of what Christ is going to be. So that is why it is very important to understand Scripture as one beautiful story that is leading to Christ. And that is what we are attempting to do through this series. And we are looking at few major stops in the entire story of the Bible. We are looking at this entire story of Scripture like a train journey, and we're trying to look at the major stops in order to connect the entire story of Scripture. Now, if you have not watched the first video, I would highly recommend you to watch that first before you continue with this. But if you don't have the time, it's okay. You will anyway get a lot of value from this video as such as well. Now, in the first video, we talked about the entire story of Scripture and how the single strand or the single theme that connects the story is, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you. And we have seen from Genesis to Revelation connecting the major themes and major covenants that led us to that story. We started with the fall, that was our stop 1, and we ended with stop 7 in Revelation. And we have 5 stops in between, which are 5 videos starting with this one. We will be covering in detail. We've already looked at them briefly in the first video. So if you watch that, you already know the overarching story. But getting into the details now, into all of these 5 stops, helps us get a much clearer picture and appreciate these details to see how it all led to Christ. And not only just because we appreciate the details, but also to see how God dealt with His people, because the nature of God doesn't change, right? The character of God doesn't change. And that's the reason we need to look into these stories. So today we're going to look at the major stop, which is the covenant with Abraham. Now, why this becomes important? Because that is the beginning of God's covenant relationship with the nation of Israel, who are the descendants of Abraham. Now, whenever the apostles in the New Testament preached the gospel, especially as they began with the Jews and in the synagogues, they usually told the entire story of Scripture and how it led to Christ. And they often began with the calling of Abraham. You talk about Stephen in Acts chapter 6, when he tells about the story of Christ before the Sanhedrin. He starts with Abraham and goes all the way up to Christ, the coming of Christ. Similarly, Paul, when he went on his first missionary journey, and it was, I think, in Pisidian Antioch, where he preached in the synagogue, he again started with the story of Abraham and how it ultimately connected to Christ. So the apostles themselves, the first century Christians, and the disciples of Christ themselves, when they presented the gospel, it was not something like a new religion, but it was something, a continuation of what God has been revealing to his chosen people all along. And that's why we call it the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's all one story throughout. So whenever the apostles told the story of Christ, they always started with the story of Abraham. Now usually, since they spoke in the synagogues to begin with, it made sense for them to start with Abraham's story, because they all were aware of that. But if it is a Gentile crowd, I think we should start much before that, in Genesis, where you don't have this setting of predominantly Jewish Abraham calling kind of a setting, but it's a more neutral, whole world perspective that we see when we start with Genesis. Now, we know that, as we have seen in the first video, and if you have read scripture, Genesis, we know that God created man in his image, and man chose to seek independence from God and rebel against God, and we see the fall of man. And right there in the beginning of Genesis, I think that it's the 3rd chapter, where we have kind of like a council where God is dealing with humans and the serpent after that whole episode of the fall. And God tells that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. That was our first stop. So humanity as such have lost that intimate relationship with God because of our sin, that union between heaven and earth, and divine and human, that was fractured because of our sin. And God promises that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And we have seen how that ultimately led to Christ. And we will see in these details, we will go in depth and see how that actually led to Christ, though we've already seen the overview. So now we come to Abraham. So between the story of the fall and Genesis chapter 1, we have about 10 to 11 chapters, and in 12th chapter is where we see Abraham. Now I want to just talk quickly about the setting of Abraham's time. You see, Abraham lived somewhere in the 21st to 22nd century BC, right? It was called the Middle Bronze Age. Now, early human civilizations actually prospered along this Middle Eastern area in what we call the Fertile Crescent, from the Nile Delta up till Tigris and Euphrates River, which goes into Mesopotamia and all that. So even secular archaeology and all shows that this was the first places where human civilizations prevailed, right? And this was a very a lot of things happened here. This area prospered a lot because of the fertile land. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. Crescent because it looks like a moon, the shape of that stretch of land. So God calls a man from this place, Abraham. Now God's intention is, like from the beginning of creation, is that man would live under his blessing, would look to him, would derive his wisdom, and thrive as humanity, to glorify God and to benefit humanity. So that was God's intention. And after having lost that, right, God chooses this one man, Abraham, and through him God says that he will bless all the nations of the earth. We will see the details of that. But before that, I just want to quickly mention, this doesn't mean that before Abraham there was nobody who served God after the fall. Right? I believe there is always a remnant, a faithful remnant who served God, maybe a few in number, because we see the evidence of that in Melchizedek, right, who was around the time of Abraham, and he served the living God too. And that let's look at these few verses about how God called Abraham. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. 12:7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. So God calls this man, Abram, from Ur of the Chaldeans, and he is asking him to go to this land that he promises to give him. Right? So this is the same place where the Tower of Babel was built. So from this very same place of rebellion, God is calling this man and asking him to go to a land that would show him. Excuse me. So he goes. Abraham trusts God and he moves. And God promises him three things there: land, descendants, blessing. So land doesn't mean some real estate dealing here, but for them land meant everything, right? It was an agrarian culture. That was their livelihood. That was where they built their homes and a sense of belonging that they had with the land. But today, in a metropolitan culture, you live in apartments, you don't own anything, you just rent a place and go. So we may not understand the importance of it, but we need to understand the land here meant their sense of livelihood and everything. And that's the importance we need to understand. And that was a fertile area. It's not like any land. And in those days, and in that particular civilization, that was the most fertile area. And so God was promising something beautiful to them, and that's why it's called the land of milk and honey. Later on, as we look into the episodes in the stories, so God promises him land, descendants, and blessing. Right? And blessing is the important thing here, because it's not about that they're living happily ever after in the land, because you're not going to live forever in the land. And in fact, the book of Hebrews says that Abraham was looking to a heavenly home, looking forward to a heavenly home, whose builder and architect is God himself. So although land and descendants is important, we'll look at that, but the blessing is the most important part, living under God's blessing. So Abraham obeys God and he moves to the promised land, and we see that he had many ups and downs, right? He was not like always this perfect father of faith. He had many ups and downs. If you see chapter 13, 14, 15, he had some ups and some downs. And in chapter 15, we actually see the covenant being made. Of course, here God calls Abraham and he promises a few things, but the actual covenant is actually made in chapter 15. And this happens right after the episode of Abraham rescuing Lot and Melchizedek blessing and all of that. And here, God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I am your reward, your exceedingly great reward, right? And Abraham says, well, I don't have any descendants, and everything that I own is going to go to a stranger. Someone else is going to be my heir. So what is the reward about? And God says, no. Your heir will not be this stranger, but your own flesh and blood. And God makes a covenant with him, and and let's look at those verses. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but his son, who is your own flesh and blood, will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so we see, and we read here that Abraham had a genuine question. And in response, God takes him out and shows him the stars in the sky and says, Abraham, try counting them. As numerous, as impossible as it is to count the numerous stars, God says, so numerous will your descendants be. And Abraham believed God, and it says Abraham believed, and it was accounted to him, it was credited to him as righteousness. Right? So he was made righteous by his faith, and this is what James quotes as well in the New Testament, in the book of James. So, and that's a very important thing we'll come to in a bit when we talk about in a few minutes. And so, and he also says in the following verses, we'll not look at that, but that God will give this land, all the land that you see, Abraham, before you, I will give it to your descendants. And Abraham says, Lord, how can I be sure about it? And that is when God says, Abraham, bring me a heifer and a bird, and God asks him to offer sacrifice. And when these sacrifices offered, when Abraham, so when he offers the sacrifice, he basically cuts the animal into in two, and then as he prepares that sacrifice, God walks a fire, a torch of fire, which represented God's presence, walked through or went through this animal sacrifice that was spotted. So that is a very important thing to understand, because you see, we need to understand the concept of covenants, right? Covenants is not just between Abraham and God, but covenants was part of the culture of the time. People made covenants all the time between two parties, between two countries, and between two families sometimes, right? Covenants were very important, and when they made covenants, there was usually a sign to the covenant in order to remind them of the covenant, and a lot of times it was the animal sacrifice. And when the animal was cut as a sacrifice, they would walk in between the animals, so as a symbol that what happened to this animal be done to me if I do not keep the covenant. And so when God was walking in the form of the torch that went in between the animals, God was saying that, Abraham, I make this covenant with you, and I keep that covenant. And mind you, Abraham didn't walk through the sacrifice, only God walked through it. It was an unconditional covenant that God would bless the nations through this man Abraham. Abraham believed. Abraham believed that God would do this, and that's what this verse says. And then, of course, even though he believed, he had some ups and downs, because we see after this the Hagar episode and all of that, right? Because Abraham must have reasoned, okay, God said, my descendants, my heir will be from my own flesh and blood. Ishmael, even if I have a son through Hagar, at the behest of my wife Sarah or whatever, even if I have a son through Hagar, it is still my own flesh and blood. Abraham would have reasoned that way. And then in chapter 17, God kind of was very displeased with what Abraham did. And in fact, that opening verse in chapter 17, when God comes to speak to Abraham, God says, Abraham, walk blameless before me. So I don't think God was very pleased with what Abraham has done with Hagar. But anyway, God comes there and once again tells that, hey, I will give you a son through Sarah. Now, I want to take a minute to explain the importance of that. What is happening here is that Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness, as we saw in chapter 15. Now, that's the important aspect, faith, right? So this whole covenant where God is making with Abraham to bless the nations of the earth, it is through faith. It is not through my works. It is not through what I do. It is not through my plans, right? Even the promise of the descendants was through faith and not what Abraham could accomplish. Even the begetting of the descendants was through faith in God. And that was the importance of the covenant. It was not just physically being part of Abraham's children, right? It is a concept that I will come to in detail also in a bit from here, which will be repeated in a bit from here. So it is not about the physical children of Abraham, but it is about faith in God, and even these children who come physically from Abraham living out of that faith. Now that doesn't mean everybody else are useless, right? The people in Abraham's household could still believe in God and become part of his people. But the point here is faith, and that was represented in how Isaac was begotten. And that's the point we need to capture, because that becomes important in the story of Ishmael, which you have just seen, and also in Jacob and Esau as well. Now, Abraham dies, and we need to understand that this covenant was, although it's called covenant with Abraham, multiple times God says that, especially in chapter 17, let's look at that verse. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful, I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. So this covenant was not just with Abraham to make him feel happy and good and bless him, but this was a covenant with him and his descendants, and to bless the entire nations of the earth for all time. Right? So even after Abraham dies, we see that God comes to Isaac and reinforces that promise to Isaac as well. And in fact, before Abraham dies, he makes sure that Isaac does not live within the culture of the Canaanite culture around him, but Abraham makes sure that Isaac marries someone from his own household in Aram. Right? Now that's important because, you see, it's not that the Arameans where Abraham's relatives were, that they were very godly or anything like that, but they had some knowledge of the Lord as compared to the others. We'll not go into the details, but to just give you a brief idea of what I'm saying about, you see, the whole world after the flood was again spread through Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And Shem was a righteous man, and God's blessing, if you read Genesis, you see, was on Shem, and they clung to God more dearly than the other two. And so the Semites, or the people of Shem, had this fear of God compared to the other people, because Canaanites were completely, lived so out of touch with God. And so these Semites had at least some knowledge of God, and that is why Abraham tells to his servant Eliezer to go and find a wife for Isaac from the Arameans, who is the Semitic people who had at least some knowledge of God. The Canaanites were the descendants of Ham, not Shem, right? But anyway, so that is some little insight for us to grasp as to why Abraham told him to go to Aram to find a wife for Isaac. So anyway, so Isaac, God comes to him and he says, just like I was with Abraham, I'm going to be with you. Let's look at that verse. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. So just like God blessed Abraham, now God is blessing Isaac. And let's see another verse. Chapter 26 verse 2. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all the nations on the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. So you see that it was not just the covenant with Abraham. God is reinforcing the same words to Isaac and saying that, hey, it's not just the covenant with your father, but I make that same covenant with you. You are part of that covenant. You are born, in fact, you're born out of that covenant promise that I made with Abraham. And God says, I will bless you. I make a covenant with you and your descendants, and I will give this land. And God reinforces that covenant with Isaac. And then we see God doing the same thing with Jacob as well. And important to understand here, why just Jacob and why not Esau?